Welcome once again to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast for November 2023. So a little bit about us. The Stewardship Network is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 place-based member communities from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of every month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. We mobilize folks through our TSN member communities. We make collaborative ecological stewardship accessible to all through our place-based collaboratives. We equip TSN member communities by removing hurdles to their work so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. We are so proud to support our member communities in this important work as they protect local native ecosystems in their geographies. And finally, we connect the specialized knowledge we've collected from and for TSN member communities, and we share it as widely as possible. And the connect pillar for us takes many different forms. This webcast is a great example of it. And also we have the Stewardship Network Conference, which next year will be back for the first time since COVID in person in East Lansing at the Kellogg Center. We're so very excited to be back in person, very grateful that we're able to do that. And so please check out our website at stewardshipnetwork.org/conference, and you will find information about the Stewardship Network Conference 2024, which will be in January 29th and 30th of 2024. We have some really exciting updates. The speakers and agenda are now online. And so you can look at our keynotes, our concurrent sessions, and our evening session information, and the bios of all the presenters that we have. We have an amazing array of presenters that we're excited to host for the conference. And so we hope that you'll join us at the Stewardship Network Conference, January 29th and 30th of next year. Early bird registration is available now until November, so at the end of November. So if you'd like to save some money, we encourage you to do so. Get ahead of your calendar, and it also helps us prepare so that we know how many people to expect. So please do consider registering before the end of this month if you'd like to take advantage of early bird registration rates. And with that, I would like to invite our Executive Director, Lisa Brush, with a few important updates on the organization. So Lisa, please take it away.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rob. Hi, all. Great to be with you. I miss hosting these and being with you live every month. But as Bob said, our conference is like 40 webcasts in 2 days. And so we hope to see you there. And I wanted to tell you about a really exciting fundraising opportunity that we have right now. We have a generous donor who has agreed to contribute $250,000 if we raise $250,000. So if you want to throw a little love, a little money our way, $5 because you like tuning into the webcast, $5,000, we appreciate it. We're at 100,000 right now. Actually, we're at more than 100,000 right now. And Bob will drop in the link where you can just make an easy online donation. We would love that. We'd appreciate any and all help that you can give getting us to 250,000, because if we don't hit 250, we don't get 250. So really great opportunity, and we're really grateful to our generous donor. And then another opportunity that you could have to support the Stewardship Network in doing things like offering these free monthly webcasts is if you don't see the organization that you're affiliated with on this list, you could sponsor the conference. And that would be another way to help us meet our match and join this amazing powerhouse of groups. We've got more sponsors coming in every day. But if you've got a line to somebody at your organization that you can say, hey, let's get in and sponsor this conference, we would love to have you, add you to our logo farm, as we call it, our trusted friends. So again, thank you all for the work that you all do each and every day out in your communities. It's a real pleasure to be able to work with and bring you all together to learn from each other. And with that, I would like to introduce Jillian Farkas, who's a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And today we're going to be talking about the Great Lakes Piping Plover recovery. So really awesome story and a great one for all of us to learn from. And with that, Jillian, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Lisa. I appreciate it. Let me pull it on up. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I'm Jillian Farkas, and I'm going to talk to you about Great Lakes Piping Plover recovery today. So I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I have been since 2020. So this is the Great Lakes Piping Plover. This is this wonderful bird that I get to work with. For those of you who haven't seen it in person, it is bigger than a chickadee and smaller than a robin. It has this distinct black band around its neck and a band connecting its two eyes is another black band. It has a lightly colored sand back and is a shoreline specialist. Sometimes the piping plover is confused with a killdeer. Piping plovers tend to just nest along the Great Lakes shoreline, whereas killdeer, I wish that the piping plover nested like the killdeer did. Killdeer will nest in your kids' soccer field or in the Kroger parking lot and still be able to fledge chicks. So if you're seeing a killdeer inland, or a bird inland, it's likely a killdeer. They're both plovers, but piping plovers are a little bit more rare. So in 1986, the Great Lakes piping plover population was listed as federally endangered underneath the U.S. Endangered Species Act. So historically, we had maybe 500 to 700 pairs, and compared to the Great Plains population or the Atlantic population that can have upward of 2,000 plus pairs, we are very vulnerable to chance and demographic and environmental events that can potentially extirpate the species. At the time of listing, we had approximately 12 to 17 pairs, so very, very, very few individuals. Historically, we had nesting all throughout the Great Lakes, like I said, 500 to 800 pairs, a Great Lakes shoreline specialist. At the time of listing in the late 1980s, we had really just a cluster in the northern lower part of Michigan and some of the sites in the eastern Upper Peninsula, which includes Whitefish Point, Grand Marais, Sleeping Bear, and Wilderness State Park. In 2023, we're starting to see that distribution throughout the Great Lakes again. We had nesting on all 5 Great Lakes, 4 states and 1 Canadian province, and we're kind of seeing this use of shoreline habitat around the Great Lakes system. So what caused this decline of piping plovers? They are shoreline specialist species, which means that they're only using the Great Lakes shoreline. This image was taken from eBird. Some of the inland sites that you'll see, it's where they're stopping potentially along migratory as they make their way up to the breeding grounds. But they really only have a really small subset of habitat that they use to breed and occupy. They also only have 1 clutch of eggs in a given year. They will have typically 4 eggs in a clutch. There is the potential to re-nest if they do lose their clutch to predation or a washout. However, they're not fledging those previous four chicks or 4 eggs. So they have a hard time really being able to grow the population because they're kind of a slow growing population to do so. In addition to just being a shoreline species, they have other things acting against them for their success. And this includes shoreline development, just the hardening of the shoreline. In the 1950s, the shoreline really started to develop, which causes overlap with piping plover habitat, making it more limited to what they're able to use. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there's also a market for hunting and collecting piping plovers, whether or not was feathers or for meat or just shorebirds in general, and even just scientific collecting to put into museums. And then in around the 1920s, we had the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Lacey Act, which aimed to help protect birds, especially shorebirds, and that in hopes that we would help to be able to recover some of these shorebird species. However, recreation also started to increase along these beach shorelines, and that's also increased overlap with habitat of the piping plover. And so as you see, just dense number of humans, both in the breeding ground and in the wintering ground. So the bottom left image is along the Texas coastline where they're able to drive their vehicles along the shoreline. And we only had the piping plovers for potentially 4 months in the best case scenario in a given season. Otherwise, they're down in the breeding or in the wintering grounds for 8 months and with limited protections depending on where they are. Additionally, some people choose to ignore signage even when it's present. And so it's just overlapping of habitat with recreation. There's also been an increase in predator populations with humans using more of the beach more often, potentially leaving trash and just landfills in general. We've kind of seen an increase in some predators, including gulls and corvids and ravens that especially target the chicks, but also just we've seen increases of dogs and cats that have led to the predation of piping plovers as well. But don't worry, we have a plan. So maybe worry a little bit. It's hard to recover a species, but we created, along with partners, many partners, to create this recovery plan in 2003 to have 5 criteria to help for delisting. And so we aim to have 150 pairs for 5 years, 1.5 to 2 chicks fledged per pair, protections and long-term maintenance of essential winter and breeding habitat. Genetic diversity is deemed to be adequate for the population, and also agreements and funding mechanisms for long-term protections and management. So I'm going to go into a couple of these criteria. So getting to 150 pairs for 5 consecutive years. We're looking to have 100 pairs be within Michigan and 50 pairs being in other Great Lakes states. And so this past year, we had 80 pairs, the most since endangered species listing. So we were very excited to see. This was an increase from last year of 72 pairs. And in general, we've seen this steady increase within the population. We have some divots, and that is normally corresponding to high water levels or potentially a novel predator that's been introduced in the population or that's ramped up numbers. For example, merlins have really started to be a impact to our population, as well as coyotes have recently at some sites been something that we have to do adaptive management for. So we kind of see this ebb and flow in the population, but in general, we're on the incline. And so with distribution, we have 57 of our pairs in Michigan this past year, 11 in Wisconsin, 3 in New York, 4 in Pennsylvania, and 5 in Canada. So compared to last year, again, we have an increase of 8 pairs overall within the population, an increase of 9 within Michigan, an increase of 1 pair in Pennsylvania, and a decrease in 1 pair in Canada and Wisconsin, and New York remained the same. And so we have 57 of those 100 pairs for Michigan currently, and 23 of those 50 pairs outside of Michigan for the Great Lakes states. So another criteria within the recovery plan is having an average of about 1.5 to 2 chicks fledged per pair for 5 years. And this was chosen because it's thought that with 10-year projections that will have the population be stable or continue to grow. This past year, we fledged also the most ever chicks that we've ever fledged, 167 chicks, including with our captive reared population. And so we had a wild fledge rate of 1.6 chicks fledged per pair and 2.1 when we include those 39 chicks that we fledged with captive rearing. And so with captive rearing, this 39 chicks, that's a tie for the highest number that we've ever released into the wild. And so I'm really grateful for that program. We'll kind of talk about how we meet those goals. And so we couldn't meet these goals without all of our amazing partners and the dedication and the thousands and thousands of hours that go into all of the protections and work for these piping plovers. And so I used to say the piping plover program had 3 pillars for its success, and that is predator management, protection and monitoring, and the captive rearing program. But there's truly so many other arms, including the volunteers, education and outreach, the public participation, and habitat management. There's so many factors that go into trying to recover the species. So captive rearing is one of those pillars that help us with the program. And so we have a captive rearing facility at the University of Michigan Biological Station in Pellston, Michigan. And that is run by the Detroit Zoo, and it's existed since 2001. And it's a multi-zoo effort to manage the captive rearing of abandoned piping plover eggs. We are not doing an active breeding program within piping plovers. We are only rearing eggs that have been salvaged from the wild due to an abandonment from the adults, or the predation of one of the adults of a nest, or if there's a washout of a nest, or if there's an extra copulation within the population, which we've been seeing the past couple of years. So piping plovers require both adults to help raise the chicks, both incubate and raise the chicks. And so if we lose an adult of a nest, the single adult won't be able to raise the chicks on their own. And so we've been very grateful to have the Detroit Zoo and the many zookeepers, as well as the University of Minnesota and other folks that have really stepped in to help raise these adorable birds, really. So we really try to keep the habitat and experience similar to the wild. So once they hatch in that top right corner, We try to have a stuffy with them with the first like 24 hours as they start to get underneath the heating lamp and start to become mobile. And then eventually we put them in an indoor pen that's small, so that way they're not expending all of their energy running around. And in that far right corner on the bottom, you can kind of see some feathers. So that's a feather duster that we have upside down that's supposed to act kind of as a parent. We have a heating lamp. And then in the top left, you can see this kind of fenced in exclosure. And so that's an outdoor pen that we have. And once they reach, I believe, 10 days, we feel comfortable putting them in this outdoor pen where it's to protect them from predators, but also have them not escape, but also give them that experience of being on a lake, being within the sand in a natural environment, hearing noises. We have in these indoor environments, we also have just waves that are playing, Great Lakes waves. Whenever they're getting transported, we do a parental call to try to tell the chicks, like, this isn't normal, you're not supposed to be handled. So that way they can start to, they don't just get adjusted to humans. So we've had 361 captive reared birds released to date, which is truly phenomenal. So a couple of our statistics we've had in 2023, we had 20 clutches that were incubated, 14 clutches had hatched. So from Michigan, we had 1 from Sleeping Bear, 3 from High Island, and 1 from Leland State Park, 1 from Cat Island, 1 from the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin. And in New York, we had 2 from Sandy Island Beach State Park. And in Pennsylvania, we had 2 clutches. And from Canada, we had 3 clutches. And so overall, we were able to release 39 captive reared individuals, 20 from Michigan and 20 in Michigan, and then the rest were released outside of Michigan, which is really exciting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But we have 14 captive reared adults that we observed on the breeding grounds, 7 of which were breeding this year. So they're really contributing to the population as well. So for the first time ever, we released birds outside of Michigan. And this was done because we had so many piping plovers, and we thought that this would be a great idea to try to experiment. And we wanted to do this in Illinois, where we currently don't have any piping plovers, well, any breeding piping plovers, and to try to see if we release captive reared birds to a site, is there a likelihood that they will return to that site to breed? And working with the state of University of New York, with Jonathan Cohen and Allison Kosek, we looked at some data and we saw that 75 to 100% of the time where captive reared birds are released, they're likely to return. And so we are very optimistic that we'll be able to get some piping plovers to return to Illinois, or to see if this will be a success. And because we lost some birds in New York, we wanted to try to supplement the eastern part of the population. And because the New York site is 12 plus hours away from the captive rearing facility, to try to minimize the stress of the birds, we flew birds to New York. So this was a huge collaborative effort with multiple research partners, University of Minnesota, SUNY ESF, the Detroit Zoo, University of Michigan, Pellston. So many folks contributed to try to make these decisions. And we're really optimistic for the success. So far, we've seen 9 of our 39 captive reared individuals in the wintering grounds, and we're really hopeful for where they come back in the summer. We also had, for the first time since I was in the position, we were importing Canada eggs from Canada. And that took many partners to act so quickly, including APHIS, the Canadian federal government, our federal government with Fish and Wildlife Service, the Port Authority, to be able to try to just bring eggs over from Canada. And everyone worked together quickly and went above and beyond to help bring in birds that we were able to release, 1 at New York, and 2 in Michigan, I believe. So another pillar is our monitoring, protection, and banding. So we start the year off in April, some sites as early as March, trying to be able to find the piping plovers, see where they're coming to be able to monitor their breeding. So we'll have folks come out with spotting scopes, really try to monitor tracks and see what territories are being set up. And then we will put up these exclosures over nests once we find them. We'll put up signage to help aid in the protection of the piping plovers. And so these monitors will look at, monitor at least for 2 hours, see if there's a nest exchange between the 2 adults. They'll observe any behaviors that they're seeing. They'll observe when the nests hatch. They'll observe any predators. They'll observe number of dogs off leash incidences. And we just collect all this data to be able to know when our birds are going to fledge and what the success of the program is. We also are able to do banding of birds. This helps us determine who's banding where, potentially what sites are more successful than others when we're seeing them in the wintering grounds, and just trying to adjust like our expectations and trying to see where everybody's ending up. And so each bird technically gets a unique combination, but each brood gets the same combination, with the only difference being this upper orange band with a little dot on it. So they'll get a different color dot depending on, they'll get a unique one, but they'll get their adult breeding band combination when they come back to breed the following year, hopefully when they do come back, just because otherwise they'd be decked out in all the bracelets and it's not a T-Swift concert. And so we're trying just to minimize the number of bands that we can put on, but still be able to identify the individual. We also have an education outreach arm between having folks at state parks or Sleeping Bear or different institutions talking about bark rangers or just general education and outreach. The Detroit Zoo has many signs and materials. We have a Great Lakes Piping Plover Facebook website to try to make people aware of everything that's going on in a given year. And many other of our partners also have Facebook websites, including, I think, Ontario Audubon talks about the New York piping plovers. Canada has a piping plover page. Chicago has a piping plover page. We've also had an Audubon Great Lakes Piping Plover campaign on how to involve more people with taking a pledge to keep their dog on leash and just like sharing the shoreline, and just numerous volunteers that have helped us throughout, just even at Sleeping Bear, just trying to connect with people and make people understand how rare and special it is to have this bird in their backyard. Another pillar we have is predator management. We get new predators all the time that enjoy piping plovers as much as I do. So just in slightly different ways. So this year we had for the first time a grackle predate one of our piping plover nests. Merlins have continued to be an issue. And then we also have gulls as issues, but the predator list doesn't tend to cease. We have foxes, skunks, possums. Sometimes we've had a snake, humans, dogs, cats, American kestrel, great horned owl. It's just, we try to come together and we work closely with APHIS Wildlife Services to do both proactive management and reactive management and try to have a collective source of knowledge to see how we can attack an issue. So predators are always changing. Merlins have been especially an issue for us in the Great Lakes. And so the two pictures on the left are from High Island. So Merlins were really, we think, queuing in on the exclosures this year at High Island. And this is a Merlin that's made its way into the exclosure and is predating an adult. And so that's why one of those nests was taken into captive rearing. Because we had such high predation at High Island, we decided not to use an exclosure for the 7th nest that they had at that site. And we have these field cams on some of our nests, and we got to record a Caspian tern for the first time, killing an adult piping plover. So it's just a lot of challenges that we face. And then this bottom right one is a coyote at Sleeping Bear. We've had several issues the past few years that they're queuing in on exclosures or queuing in on chick time. And they're teaching the pups to just attack piping plover chicks. And so then we'll find them dead, which is really dismaying. So we're working with APHIS to come up with a proactive management or just kind of what tools we have in our toolkit. We also work with several other partners, including the Smithsonian, who's doing a Merlin study for non-lethal removal. That's with Nathan Cooper, who's done a lot of work with Kirtland's warbler. He's putting these geolocators on Merlins to really understand their home range size and potentially looking at non-lethal removal. So if we translocate individuals to a different site, what is the likelihood that they're going to come back to our site? So can we move them? Will they stay away for 28 days during this crucial time for piping plovers? So we're really trying to diversify our toolkit for predator management while also making it with sound scientific reason. Several of our sites also use scarecrows, which require humans to move it around at least every day. We do these predator exclosures with metal chicken wire. And so that's typically a 4x4 fence, as well as just to minimize predation. And then some sites are doing this plastic apron to prevent digging predators, to get under exposures. Some folks use pyrotechnics to scare gulls or just shoo them off of a site. But it's a huge partnership with USDA, APHIS, and all of our partners to really try to get at predator management. We also have a research angle where we're looking at different genetics. We're looking to see with buccal swabs and fecal samples to see what are the piping plovers eating? What is its diet composed of? Does that diet differ depending on what site is available? Does that also lend into the success of a site more so than another? We're also looking to work with USGS to look at habitat resiliency over time underneath certain climatic variables to see which sites should we try to really be proactive with habitat management in the case of, like, are these sites that we can really buffer around either high water levels, or should we be putting more efforts into the UP if there's an expansion to going further north? Working with the Smithsonian with predator management, working to see with captive rearing ways that we can adapt, we use that information to see what sites are potentially more successful in yielding captive, or to have captive reared individuals return. Are captive reared individuals returning to the site that they're released at? Just having that data and making really informed decisions. And all this couldn't be possible without Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding, which largely funds most of our piping plover program to be able to do this research, do this monitoring and protection, to do predator management, to do captive rearing. So we also do habitat management. A lot of sites will do invasive species pulling and herbicide spraying both before the season and after the season. We can't really do it during the season just because we don't want to impact the birds or the chicks. Several of our sites have tried to put cobble to be more enticing to the piping plovers to try to breed at that location. The Cat Island, there was an Army Corps project that made this series of kind of dredge channels, and as a result we have piping plovers breeding there, which wasn't necessarily expected, but it's been this really hot spot for a lot of migratory birds. And so kind of what we're also planning is how can we potentially work with the Corps to use dredge materials in a beneficial way? Could we use it for piping plover habitat to create more resilient islands in different capacities in certain scenarios? And so the Atlantic coast has done some work with dredging island creation, or looking at different variables with different habitats to try to see, okay, this is the ideal habitat, potentially the tides coming in, but they typically have this invertebrate sources for the piping plover. So this is a top tier habitat. So how do we do innovative ways to have Great Lakes characteristics when we're doing this habitat formation? And is that possible? And how can we collaborate? Another thing that's led to the success of our program are weekly Great Lakes calls, as well as weekly Michigan calls. We are trying to increase transparency and collaboration and not reinvent the wheel. We have a lot of experts that have lived with piping plovers for decades, not literally, they're not staying out on the beach for time and time, but just being able to have that collective knowledge. And even if the call is only 20 minutes, it's that consistency and having the right people at the table to have that knowledge to be able to have innovative ideas. So all of this has led to a really great season that we had. So we had 80 pairs, potentially 82. We had 2 sites that potentially, one was very difficult to get out to, and one we couldn't get somebody there to check in time. We had 85 nests in total. Of that, 61 hatched. We lost 24 nests, which is higher than what we had in 2022, where we lost only 7, I believe. 20 were due to abandonments, 13 of which were due to adult predation specifically. Like I mentioned, we had lost birds to merlins, Caspian terns. We had other unknown causes. And then we also had 7 captive reared birds nesting in the population. And so what's interesting about our population is we have a pretty young birds that are nesting. So 60% of our population is 1st to 3rd year nesters, and 16% is 4 to 6 year nesters. And a small part of our population is 7 to 9, and then even smaller is our 10 to 14. So piping plovers can live a really long time. I think our oldest plover is 15 or 16 years old that we had in a population. But the majority of our birds are first-year nesters. And in 2022, we had 160 chicks that had fledged. And so of that, we got 41 back. And so that's about a 26% return rate. So even if we have a really good year, there's a lot of variables outside of our control with how they come back. So we face a lot of challenges. These are the adorable piping plovers that we released in Chicago. We only have 4 months of the year that we get these piping plovers. We have limited staff time and availability, whether it's to go out and monitor. If you're going out to monitor on the beach, you're also potentially doing outreach with the public. You're asking dogs to stay on leashes. Whether it's predator management, choosing which site to get out to. Some it might be an island, and so then you're out there for several days until you can get back, or you're only able to target one species instead of several. I recognize that it's a wild species and there's only so much that we can do. We can't put it in a protective bubble, but it takes a lot of time and effort to help protect these species and just its general overlap of habitat with humans. So the piping plovers truly need your help, and everybody can do their part in helping piping plovers and shorebirds in general. And that's keeping dogs away from shorebirds, leaving at home, leashed in dog-only areas, respecting fencing and signage. So we have those exposures, but we also have a psychological fencing that's about 50 meters buffer away. And so it's this not fishing line, but it's string to kind of create a barrier, because that way the birds aren't hopping off their nests to protect themselves. Just respecting fencing and signage, picking up after yourself at the beach, any kind of trash that can help indirectly lead to predators. And so taking that back out with you is always helpful. Reporting any sightings. So if you're trying to escape the Midwest weather and you go down to wintering grounds, which can be Florida, Georgia, like the Gulf of Mexico area, the Carolinas, report any sightings that you see with those orange band piping plovers. Sometimes you need a really good camera, but reporting it to eBird or plover@universityofminnesota.edu. And if you're really interested, volunteer. We have on our website ways to interact with us to get involved with our volunteering program, and also telling folks just about piping plovers and how rare and special it is that we have these Great Lakes birds in our backyard. So a huge thank you to all of our partners. Piping plovers exist only because of the dedication and time of so many people, whether or not it's volunteers. Chicago going above and beyond to schedule 2-hour shifts to be able to monitor piping plovers consistently. So that way we're able to really have a good picture of what's going on and what can potentially lead to the success of releasing captive birds, or just monitoring the birds in general. Ohio did something similar when we had birds there back in 2021. Whether or not it's just volunteers going to Fisherman's Island and helping fill in the gaps with monitors, or it's partners that will be on calls on weekends trying to raise nests up because of abandonments or washouts, just truly everybody going above and beyond. This program is successful just because of the number of partners within it, and it doesn't go unrecognized. So with that, I will take any and all questions. So I appreciate y'all taking the time to listen.
Thank you so very much. That was incredible. Such a journey, and it's exciting to see so many young nesting pairs, hoping that graph will kind of continue to grow from left to right through all of this great work. So thank you so much, Jillian. So for folks in the audience, please feel free to continue sharing your questions. I'll start with a couple now. First, just a brief one. Do all birds in the plover family nest on the ground? Kurt had asked that question.
That's an excellent question. I'm going to say yes, but I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Good deal. Thank you. So one question I had about the predator management, because it's kind of interesting. I was noticing that particularly when you were talking about the coyotes, that they were teaching their young to predate on the piping plovers, and that seemed to be, I don't know if you'd call it a new activity, but it was a thing that you saw them teaching their young, like a learning process. And I was wondering, in terms of addressing predator management, is there any focus on thinking about the alternative food sources for predators? I'm wondering, because I know that you said like trash and all that stuff, we obviously know increases things like gull species and their populations, but I'm just wondering about any opportunities for alternative food sources for predators that might make them predate on the piping plovers less.
Yeah, we definitely talked about, actually, I had 2 calls last week about predator management. We talked about either doing that with dead fish piles with some avian predators that we have, or thinking about what we could do with coyotes as an alternative food source. And we've also talked about that with merlins too, to try to see if we can pull them away from the piping plover sites. And I guess the only thing we're thinking about is trying also not to supplement as much that might potentially cause an increase as well in the population. So it's that fine balance, or trying these new things to see what are we seeing as being successful. But it's definitely been something that we've talked about, because coyotes, we have an issue on North Manitou Island with sleeping bear, and so they just don't really have a natural predator, and they're there. There's no hunting of coyotes on the island, so they're just allowed to expand. So that's why it's been kind of a big issue for us. But I think we lost in 2022, we lost nearly like 30 fledglings from North Manitou Island, and some were so close to fledging, which was particularly heartbreaking. So
Yeah.
they're always throwing curveballs at us, but we're trying to hit them out.
I believe it. And I was thinking the same thing with, you don't want to have so much supplemented food sources that it causes the increase in population that you're trying to avoid. So that's a good point too. So then visiting some of the questions that are in the chat, another question about predation. Have you considered putting out enclosures in areas without nests so that predators don't get the reward of food every time they go into the enclosures?
We have. So it's, again, just with staff time and just being able to get folks out to that. But we're talking about doing that in Pennsylvania. I think we've done that previously at Sleeping Bear, but it also is just a finite amount of materials. So being able to, we thought about putting it away from our piping plover sites, like further down the beach. And I think in addition to trying to do a cache food of sorts too, to try to be incentivizing, but that we've definitely discussed that, but that's a great comment.
Thank you for that. There's a question too about, is there any coordination with law enforcement or other types of ways of keeping people with pets, dogs particularly, off of these areas? Like, what does it look like to try to, because I guess you want both positive and negative reinforcement of that behavior, right? But I'm just curious, how do you engage with the general public about keeping their dogs on leashes and other things like that?
So we do have signage. We do have law enforcement at some sites, but honestly, law enforcement is lacking at a lot of sites. It's hard. I've talked to different state park managers, and it's difficult to have park rangers get hired on. We do have obviously conservation officers in Michigan, but they have a multiple county or multiple areas, so they're not always able to react quickly, especially with dogs off leash. So we try to be positive about it. We have lost piping plovers to dogs off leash. We had that happen last year where someone had their dog. They took at least an adult and several individuals. We can follow up with Fish and Wildlife Service, law enforcement to go after an issue, but it's hard to get to prosecution. Even something, we had an issue in New York where somebody went through the exclosure with a stick and stabbed some of our eggs. They stabbed an egg, and luckily we're still able to fledge. They didn't stab all of them. They only got one. I don't know what their intention was. It was 18-year-old, or they were under 18. And so it's hard. It's hard to enforce it with law enforcement. And that's why we try to be proactive with just education and outreach.
Yeah, and there's a holistic approach to that, I think, too, just in general education of young people, right? And like the importance of wildlife. It's just, it's like how can you address the issue of, you're coming on the back end of it, of somebody actually doing that action, but how do you encourage appreciation for wildlife earlier in life to kind of negate those negative actions before they happen? But yeah, thank you for that. So let's see, as I'm looking through here's a good one from Geneva. How do piping plover restoration efforts dovetail with other bird restoration pushes? Have plover folks been able to teach best practices for other bird restoration efforts, or are there any notable restoration projects for other birds that have helped inform plover work?
That's an excellent question. And so I don't have any that come to mind off the top of my head. So we try to do just general beach creation. So in New York, we had a habitat restoration project where we pushed the tree line back and with shrubs, and then we got nesting there the following year. So that was really a success that we were happy to see. But thinking about, has anything helped inform piping plover work? I would say it's hard because even leaning on Atlantic Coast partners or Great Plains partners, that they occupy different habitat. And I think it's mostly trying to keep that multi-prong issue again. So we did a really big project at Wilderness State Park. So Wilderness State Park used to have an abundance. It used to be a piping plover mecca in the early 2000s. We had at least 16 pairs there. And we slowly started to see it dwindle. And we're like, okay, it's probably habitat creation. And so it was before my time, but we did a habitat restoration project at that site, trying to have push back the tree line, doing intensive invasive species management. But we just really haven't seen that plus up of pairs. And that's what we have seen are merlins on the landscape. And there's no predator management for the most part at state parks besides exclosures. And so piping plovers aren't being successful at certain sites, and then they're less likely to come back to breed at that site if they're incapable of having a successful brood for that year. And so sometimes it's not just in a vacuum where we have do the habitat restoration. It's not necessarily building it and they will come. It's building it, hoping that they come. And if they do, like, what are the other mechanisms that we can do to keep them coming? Because we also have a partner outside of Duluth, the St. Louis River Alliance, who got Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding to convert an area of concern site. And that's habitat potentially for piping plover. We've had piping plovers stop by, but no one's nested there. And so sometimes maybe the birds are picking up on something that we don't know. And I think that could be really interesting to look at with an invertebrate study as well. So I'm kind of pulling from the South Carolina site. They're really doing heavily with invertebrates and trying to see just what habitat is the best use for piping plovers, and trying to see what does that look like for the Great Lakes. Is that helping us? So that's not necessarily habitat restoration, but it kind of is with habitat that we potentially can really make sure that we target and conserve. So, but if you know of any other bird projects that we should know for piping plovers, definitely message me. That'd be great.
I appreciate that. I will make that suggestion to the group if you know of any. And I'm just thinking, I'm careful to make suggestions because, of course, I know hardly anything about this topic. But the thought came to me about different ways to protect, like, turtle populations that nest on beaches in different areas of the country or the world. And always interesting to see how information can cross-pollinate with different species that we're managing. And I think about invasive species management, with all of the people that we work with at the Stewardship Network, and certain methods can work for other geographies or other types of plants. So how do we understand what are the mechanisms for sharing this information in the most effective way? But that's excellent. Thank you. Let's see. So a question from Vicky. Why are Ontario eggs being taken to the US with young released in the States when Ontario doesn't have secure populations yet?
Excellent question. So Canada currently doesn't have a captive rearing program of its own. So that's why we were transporting it to the US, where the Detroit Zoo has been leading this program since 2001. The Toronto Zoo was holding on to the eggs, just kind of incubating it. So it's a little bit easy in that stage before they become full-on chicks. We didn't release them back into Canada because that would have been a whole another set of permits. And it's definitely something that we can try to explore. But at this time, we just weren't prepared to do so. And why we released them in New York is kind of that idea that by contributing to the far eastern population, that maybe that will cause some birds to go into Canada, because we've had several occurrences where we've had a New York piping plover then go and breed in Canada. So they kind of have a pretty good exchange. Sometimes we'll get a Canada bird up in like the UP. And so just trying to have these targeted areas that we can have a full circle population. But excellent question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can imagine the challenges of international agreements and coordination. But that's really great that you're working on it and that you can have opportunities to let those eggs find a new life somewhere else. So another question that we got, and I remember you talking about Illinois, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll ask here from Kathleen. Wondering about piping plovers at the Indiana Dunes, one of the states not mentioned. I don't know if you did mention it or not, but just wanted to ask about that.
I did not. So Indiana Dunes is a weird question mark for me and my partners because we just haven't had piping plovers there. Sometimes they'll stop over along their migration route, but no one ever settles at Indiana Dunes. And so they used to have pairs back in the 1950s. And I don't know if just really with the industrialized shoreline that's caused just plovers not to use that habitat, but we just really haven't seen any plovers nest there. I'm sure that I'll get a curveball, just like how I got with Ohio in 2021. They hadn't nested there in 83 years. And all of a sudden we're like, hello, they're here. So I would love if that issue happened with Indiana, but we just haven't had the pairs there.
Thank you for that. Another question that I was wondering about, what type of coordination are you able to do or that you wish you could do with folks in the effort to manage continued development or mixed land use of shorelines? I mean, we know that shorelines are so sought after, property values, recreation areas, all of that. And also that recreation tends to be a revenue stream for a lot of our natural areas across the state. And so I'm just curious if you could go a little bit more into what types of work you do with either developers or with municipalities about responsible land use as it relates to piping plover.
So I personally don't do anything, I guess, proactively, which could be a really great thing to do. I will do Section 7 consultations underneath the Endangered Species Act. So any federal partner, such as like the Army Corps of Engineers or any partner that receives federal funding, then needs to consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that they're not potentially impacting a federally listed species. So any projects that are potentially affecting areas within piping plover critical habitat or piping plover habitat in general come across my desk or any of my piping plover counterparts in any of the Great Lakes states to determine, is this not likely to adversely affect the species, or what conservation measures can we put into place to minimize the likelihood? And so whether or not that's long-term impact or if it's something that needs to get done, such as a dredging time, we say, okay, outside of the breeding season to minimize effects. So that way piping plovers aren't deterred from using a site, or that it doesn't impact the success, that doesn't scare it and have an adult abandon the nest, or potentially impact the fledglings and make them more likely to get spooked and then ultimately get predated. Sometimes we have issues with 4th of July during the breeding season. And so I've worked with Silver Lake State Park with their firework display. And so we've collaborated to try to identify areas that would least likely impact the piping plovers, or if the piping plovers are at an age that they're too young and they're likely to get spooked, then we'd have to decide to not do fireworks at that location. And so we've had that issue with other townships before my time, but we haven't done any long-term like municipal conversations, but that would be great. I think knowledge and just knowing that it exists and how can we have those conversations prior to the work getting done on the ground is always beneficial.
Absolutely. And it's just capacity too, right? As you've said, just the amount of time and effort that it takes to do all of these things. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had unlimited time and capacity to
I'd love that.
do all the great ideas. Yeah.
Sign me up, please.
Yeah, right. Oh my gosh. So Zach Chamberlain with Eagle had a good question. So often in the regulatory world, we're working in areas that are already impacted where plovers are unlikely to be nesting, but there is still some conservation value, like critical dunes, Great Lakes bottomlands, etc. Do you have any suggestions for practices, BMPs, or just information we can keep in mind as we work in these areas that could help support your work in the more natural areas?
I can definitely follow up with you about that, Zach, or put together a document. I think that would be fantastic. There's been some work, because you mentioned earlier, Rob, with mixed recreation use. Like people are going to still use these beaches. So then how do we work collaboratively? Like how do we compromise? And so some places on the East Coast, they've had different social science projects to interact with the communities and say like, okay, and just even project planning. So if you have a walkway going out onto the beach, if you have a dog area beach that's all the way at the other end, people are going to be like, not going to use it. So you need to have strategically put that walkway that goes right to the dog area, and hoping that piping plovers are at the other end of this. And so just trying to have human behavior be easy where they don't necessarily have to think about it can also help with these kinds of projects coming in mind. But critical dune, I mean, there's many species, it's not just piping plover. So I can definitely reach out to you, Zach, and maybe our offices can come up with a list of all species that could benefit for sure.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Zach, also Jillian's information on the slide if you'd like to reach out proactively as well. But that's amazing. I hope that all works out for you two to coordinate. So I think we'll just do one more here, and I'll keep an eye on the chat in case others come in. But from Juliet Berger, so can you talk about the pair that nested in far western Minnesota that had one unbanded parent? Is there genetic exchange between the Great Plains population and the Great Lakes population?
Excellent question. So that's also why we're looking at genetics. So it doesn't often happen that our distinct population segments overlap. And so that Minnesota pair is one that we're excited about. So we also have sometimes a hard time getting out to the Apostle Islands to do banding. So very well could have the unbanded individual being a Great Lakes bird. And so we're hoping that the genetics help elucidate that. But one of those birds that was part of that pair was a Cat Island fledgling at one point. So, okay, is there genetic exchange? So there is, but it's not often. I think total we've had that happen maybe 6 times within our population since we've been recording, since the late 1880s. Who knows? The late 1980s. So it's not very common, but we're excited to learn more.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Jillian, and thank you to everybody in the audience for your amazing questions. I really appreciate it. I'm going to just take us through a couple outro slides real quick, but I'll pause here for just a moment in case folks want to get Jillian's contact information. That was a really amazing presentation. I'm so excited about it. So thank you again. So here, as I share my screen. Okay, and as it's loading up for me, there we go. All right, so once again, I would like to remind folks about the Stewardship Network Conference happening next year, January 29th and 30th in East Lansing, Michigan. And please visit stewardshipnetwork.org/conference for more information. And I encourage you to register before the end of November to take advantage of those early bird rates for the conference. We're also talking about Meet the Match once again. So as Lisa had mentioned, really important for our organization that we meet this match, and we know that we can do it with your help. It really is so important to us, and we're so grateful for all of the support that we get from all of our supporters across Michigan and the Midwest and beyond. We're just really grateful for all of your financial support, and we hope that you see this as an opportunity to make sure that this work continues to happen. So please do consider contributing to the Stewardship Network during our end of year fundraising campaign. And we hope that you'll become a regular here at our Stewardship Network monthly webcast. So stewardshipnetwork.org/webcasts. You can register for upcoming episodes of interest. It's always on the second Wednesday of the month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour, and we'll send an email reminder the morning of for folks that register. One of our upcoming webcasts, we have Radical Ecosystem Change, applying the RAD, Resist, Accept, Direct framework with Abigail J. Lynch of the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center. We also have Identifying Recoverable Fire-Dependent Systems in the Huron-Manistee National Forest, and that's with Jesse Lincoln of the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And we have Not So Different, Using Bugs to Fight Apathy and Inspire Empathy with Christy Reddick and Jessica Honecker of The Bug Chicks. We're particularly excited about that one as we've been looking at our schedule for the year. So thank you all so much once again for being a part of the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. Thank you, Jillian, for being such a wonderful guest and for sharing all this great information. And we hope to see you all next month. Take care.